Before we get into today's podcast, I wanted to share that QCon London returns April 7 to 9, 2025. Learn what's next from world-class leaders pushing the boundaries. You'll learn actionable insights from senior software developers working on real-world projects across multiple domains. Learn more at qconlondon.com. Good day, folks. This is Shane Hastie for the InfoQ Engineering Culture Podcast. Today, I'm sitting down with Austin Vance. Austin is the CEO of a company called Focus Labs. Austin, welcome. Thanks for taking time to talk to us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shane. I'm really excited to be here.
So, we normally don't talk to CEO folks on the InfoQ podcast because we want to talk to technologists. But I'm told you are deeply a technologist. So, who's Austin?
Yeah, well, I hope I'm still a technologist. I spend a ton of my time programming still. My firm is not massive, and I kind of think the title of CEO is wonderful for a business card, but also probably CEO level decisions are not a big part of a mid-sized firm. We're not making large strategic decisions all the time. Instead, a large part of my job is setting a bar for engineering interests and engineering, consideration and excellence. And so I program. At one point, I had gotten so far from programming, I got frustrated and I decided to live stream myself programming. Started doing that about 7 or 8 months ago. And now I have 20,000 subscribers on YouTube where I live stream myself coding. And I grew up coding and talking through the code I'm writing. So a lot of just like random stuff. I'm like, I want to experiment with this API or this new technology or do a RAG or something like that. So I try to code as much as I can, but also have a nice firm.
So, one of the things that put us together was a conversation about developer onboarding. Why is it so hard and how can we do it better?
A good question. I don't know if it's hard. Might be my first reaction to that question. I think it requires intentionality. And a lot of times I think when we bring people into a culture or a company, we are not intentional about how we want them to assimilate. And what happens is a company or a group or a team assumes through some form of tribalism, series of Notion docs or a wiki, that someone will be able to figure out what's going on, and then the missing portions will be hit or will be covered through managerial one-on-ones. But the truth is, like, a culture at any company, no matter the size, is the sum of all of the people that are at the company and have been at the company. And so as soon as a new person joins, the culture shifts a little bit. And it requires intentionality to drive however that person shifts the culture back towards what you want the culture to be as a leader or as someone there. And so sitting down and really understanding first, defining what you want your culture to be and what you want, and culture, so many things we could talk about that, but what you want your culture to be and then how you can communicate that to a person so they can be the most proficient and effective is really like, that's it. It's really not that hard. It just requires concentration or intentionality. And sometimes we just get too caught up in the day-to-day that we aren't intentional about bringing that person in.
So, what does this intentionality look like? And what is the experience of being part of that intentional onboarding?
I've worked at a handful of places, and I think the best I've ever experienced, hopefully besides my firm, but the best I've ever experienced was at Braintree. I ran a division of engineering at Braintree, and I had a great time. I came in, I was the first of a kind of new layer of management. And they put me through the same onboarding as all the developers. So developers had some that was theirs where you talked about like, how do we do CI and, what's our testing culture like? And how do you do a pull request and feedback on that? So there was that kind of stuff. But then there's also a bunch of onboarding about like what it means to be at Braintree. And one of the things I really loved about that is over the course of the first, if I remember correctly, it was about a month. You spent about an hour to an hour and a half, a couple times a week with a different person who'd been at the company, and they didn't always have a big title, but a different person who'd been at the company for a little while talking to you about something that they loved or cared about deeply at the company. And for engineering, like I said, it was like some of the technical norms that you would expect out of the communication between teams. But then it was also like, what is meeting culture like? How do we communicate with each other? And then also just like, what's the history of the company? Who are we? What do we want to be? And I thought that level of intentionality and that level of time where it was like different people, different opinions, all kind of speaking towards one mission and one kind of personality, which was the personality of the organization, really made you feel like you were a part of something. early on. And it wasn't like, I mean, of course, I got great swag when I started and other stuff like all companies do, but like, I don't think that swag made me feel as a part of a new culture as onboarding did. We've copied that a lot. And so we, over the course of a few weeks, go through a handful of presentations, decks, and conversations, ending with a retrospective with all of our new hires on what we expect out of them, who we are, what our values are, what our operating principles are, what it means to be a developer or a salesperson or a marketer or anything like that at Focused.
You made the point that culture is the sum of everyone who is or ever has been in the organization, and that you need to deliberately shift it to where you want it to go. What does that intentional culture, again, look like and feel like? What's the experience of being in that culture?
I mean, the most human answer is like when you're at a place where culture is intentional, it feels good, right? It does. Like it just feels like things work. When you come into a place where culture doesn't feel intentional, it can feel chaotic, it can feel misguided. When culture is intentional, what you see is you see common traits between all of your colleagues, coworkers, professionals around you. And it's the work ethic, it's the ethos that is the company. It's not that you all have the same background or you all went to Harvard or you all have an MBA. That stuff doesn't matter as much. It's like you all approach work with the same level of rigor, the same level of thought, care, and even more so, maybe the company takes the same level of care to how each other approach each other's work. It doesn't mean that there's a good culture or a bad culture. Like some places might be super cutthroat, action oriented, top dog wins, eat what you kill. And that can be okay if that's what the company wants. And if someone comes in there and they enjoy that culture, they will feel like they belong because it's obvious what that is to them. And other cultures could be more like team oriented, collaborative, when we win, I win kind of thing. And when I win, we win. And like other people might love that. But a person who's like a top tier non-collaborative performer might feel really ostracized or feel like they're not getting the recognition they deserve. And they would maybe select out if the culture is intentionally towards more collaborative or more the other way, like a more winner takes all kind of culture or something like that.
So, what is the culture that you've tried to instill at Focus Labs, and how have you communicated that culture?
It's always evolving. Like I said, it's a sum of all at the company and all that have been. And part of that is the people that come and go really shift the culture too. I never really liked values as like a thing that companies had. I've worked for companies that had values and they essentially were Wi-Fi passwords. And so like, why do we have them? Excellence or something like that. And people are probably really familiar in this podcast with like the Netflix culture deck. Netflix has this great culture deck and it starts with like values are not something you just put on a wall. They are the litmus test for who you hire, who you fire, and who you promote. And that like really hit me in like a real way. And so really early in the days at Focused, I sat down with my team of, I think at the time we were like 5 or 6 people. And I was like, who are we? And then who do we want to be? So values can be slightly aspirational, but they can't be so aspirational that they're not true. And we landed on 3. And so our 3 values ended up being love your craft, listen first, and learn why. And we picked those 3. A lot of times you see companies with values that are like one word. It'll be like excellence, integrity, that kind of stuff. And we picked those 3 because we thought they were a little bit more action oriented. When I see like love your craft, like I want to work with people that love what they do. And in tech, that's so easy, like, or maybe not so easy, but in tech, we see it a lot. Like I'm very familiar. I came from the Ruby community and I'm really familiar with like the software as a craft kind of thing. But I want like my recruiters to treat talent acquisition like a craft. I want where like they're honing how and where and why and what they're doing to find the best talent. I want my sales teams to treat customer acquisition like a craft, where they understand messaging and communication and empathy with all their customers. And my support teams to treat support like a craft. And I want my design teams to treat design like a craft. Like just every practice at my company should be treated like a craft from the top down. The leader should be a master craftsman where everybody else is learning from them. And then listen first falls out of that, where in order to hone your craft, you have to be open to learning. And it's funny, I'm on a podcast where I spend most of the time talking and not you, but my firm were consultants. And I have a story actually from Braintree that might be one of the more embarrassing professional experiences of my life, where I sat down in a room really early at Braintree, and I had a large organization and a big title. And I sat down in a room full of principal engineers at Braintree, and I was on cloud nine because I was a big boy on the organizational chart. And they were pitching moving Braintree's APIs from REST to GraphQL for some specific things. And it was pretty early in the GraphQL days. And I kind of was like, well, that's stupid. Like GraphQL's never going anywhere. No one even knows what it is. And I kind of talked my way into sounding like an asshole. And I left the meeting, and one of the principal engineers kind of pulled me aside and told me that I'd talked my way into sounding like an asshole. And over the course of the next few weeks, he was like, I actually think that GraphQL is probably the right choice. You should spend some more time learning about it. It's your first meeting ever hearing about it. Maybe you should spend some more time figuring out what's going on here. And over the course of the next few weeks, understanding how people use the Braintree APIs, understanding what was going on, understanding more depth around GraphQL, I came to believe that GraphQL is the right decision too. And I wish I had listened first. And so, like, not that we can't have opinions and shouldn't, but I think like one of the important decisions that we make as individuals when we communicate on teams is like, when do we listen and when do we share our opinion? And then finally learn why is at the very end of all that is this deep and entrenched curiosity in how and who we are. And so, like, coming back to your question, I think the most important thing about honing a culture is really knowing what you want it to be. And then being able to really clearly articulate how someone embodies those traits, and then constantly repeating that that is the most important thing. And I really do believe that if you can articulate, repeat, and share that, performance follows really quickly, actually. Like the results just like speak for themselves.
Now, I know from our conversation before we started recording that these values are one side of it. You also then have something else that makes it more concrete.
Yeah. So values, they're still a little like high level, I guess. And so what we wanted to do, and this is specifically for our engineering teams, but we've defined a series of operating principles. And these operating principles, I kind of think of them like you have like the Boy Scout motto and then like the things that make a Boy Scout, like thrifty, kind, clean, reverent, like those types of things. And our operating principles are kind of like the things, I forget what part of the Boy Scouts it is, but they're like the things that make a Boy Scout a Boy Scout. And so we try to define a little bit more clearly what it means outside of like a value. So a personality trait or what you should be doing. And so one of my favorite values that we have is be exothermic. And so like, since we're an engineering world, I get so much feedback on this operating principle because everybody's like, what is exothermic? But since like we have a lot of nerds on this podcast, I think most people know what it means. But it means like when given energy, you create more heat than you have, or you're putting out heat. And in a professional world, what I think that means is like bring energy to the situation. In Wedding Crashers, they say, fit in by standing out. And so like the way you come into a meeting is not by being quiet in the corner, but come with a passion and energy and a charisma that makes other people want to care as much as you do. And that becomes infectious. And so we have these series of operating principles that are like guiding principles on how everybody can interact with their customers and each other. And that's really important.
I know that you also have some pretty unusual approaches to compensation. Can we dig into that?
Yeah. I absolutely despise the way traditional compensation is managed. The majority of my career before I started my own firm, I worked at big companies, big companies, or small companies that were acquired eventually by big companies. And so we dealt with compensation in a really traditional way. And if people aren't familiar, the way compensation is traditionally managed is some sort of raise budget is kind of designed for departments and the whole company. And that gets kind of passed down through tiers of upper and middle management, distributed in some kind of finger in the wind sort of way, based on performance, investment, and being reasonable based on kind of a 2% raise generally for the mass set. And then on the other side of that, a manager and peers do reviews of each other, and they do some form of like meets expectations, exceeds expectations, or falling behind. And then this manager has a raise budget, and they get to dole that out to say their 10 or so direct reports based on meeting expectations or not. And it happens once a year. That's the last thing. It happens once a year. And I've always found that to just be a absolutely horrible way to manage performance. I have spent so much time in my life sitting in rooms with leaders at enterprises, convincing them that they de-risk their software by releasing often, nightly, daily, weekly, If you want to de-risk the release of software, which means that like if there's any failure, you can fix it quickly or we can manage it quickly, the same should be true for our people by releasing often. And a big way we release often, or a company releases with its people, is by rewarding the people that are being excellent and managing the people that are not proactively. And the easiest way to do that is through like not or by giving or not giving raises to people. If I find out only every 12 months whether or not I'm doing well or not, it's probably a pretty bad way to like live and bad way for the company to like handle reward and promoting. So the way we do it, we run a raise cycle every 6 to 12 weeks for every single person in the company. So we have managers collect feedback constantly through one-on-ones. We have peers. We do daily peer review feedback sessions, that kind of stuff. We have well-defined job description and growth pathways as you move from like senior to staff engineer or junior to normal engineer or whatever. And every 6 to 12 weeks, we say, where does this person fit? And we think they've gotten really good. They took a leadership position over this set of features with this customer. They're actually performing now at this level. And we give a small raise. And that raise doesn't have to be thousands and thousands of dollars. Instead, it could be a few hundred or $1,000 or something like that. But if you get that every 6 weeks, it compounds throughout the year as like a good job, a good job, a good job. You're on the right track. You're on the right track. And you watch over the course of the year, your compensation increases dramatically, but you've also continued to get pushed in the right direction. Here's what you're doing well. Also allows us to correct really quickly for anyone who's not performing. Hey, we're not going to give you a raise this time because like we're really seeing you disengage. You've been showing up late a lot. It's been really hard for you. You've been cameras off and not talking to the customer. You had a feature that you were stuck on for a few weeks and you didn't communicate that, whatever it is. Let's get that fixed. And in 6 weeks, they fix it and they come back, they get a raise, right? Compensation follows. So you can actually correct behavior more proactively and bring employees back who might be lost versus them kind of sitting in this like negative cycle for, at most 12 months and then being lost. There's a really positive way to manage people is through compensation and all the conversations that surround that compensation change. And so that's how we do it. We continue to hone it. We tried to do it every 4 weeks. That was like way too much overhead. We've found that like somewhere between 6 and 12 is right.
Completely different to, I'm sure, most organizations and potentially disruptive. I wonder, you've made the point, Focused is a relatively small company at the moment. How do you think that's going to scale?
I think it scales phenomenally. And the reason I think it scales phenomenally, and I get this feedback a lot, but the reason I think it scales phenomenally is like management at scale is the formulation of abstraction layers over complex people systems, right? The same way we create an interface to talk between, services, we create interfaces which are managers to talk between teams doing individual and important things. And if through culture, training, onboarding of managers, everybody understands the value of the kind of lean compensation model or continuous compensation model, then at each level, the managers really understand what's going on. And it scales kind of horizontally fairly simply. The harder part about it, and what has been interesting through the tech cycle recently, is we anchor the midpoint compensation for each of our titles in the market average, well, the 60th percentile or 65th percentile of the market. And so over the course of my career, the 65th percentile of the market has only gone up until about 3 years ago. And so watching how the mean compensation for a staff engineer has changed was always like, well, you could stay staff engineer and your comp could continue to go for the last 15 years, but then the last three, maybe it plateaued, or maybe even a staff engineer off the street would make a little less than someone who was hired 5 years ago. And so managing those conversations and understanding that has been a really interesting and really difficult part of the lean compensation, but it's actually done really well because it's helped us proactively talk about whether or not like the talent that we have has stagnated or is growing. And then the people who maybe are sitting at the same level they had been for a few years, how can we push them to grow more? Or is that like the right talent for the firm?
Another thing that I know you have opinions on is the role of management. What is the role of a manager in a tech organization?
Well, hanging off of compensation, I think a lot of places I see management kind of fit into two buckets. One is very paternal style management, where you do like a lot of like, how are you feeling at work kind of thing. And then there's other places that do a lot of performance style management. Are you hitting your numbers and your metrics? I think management can be both, but I see often organizations lean one way or the other. The first thing I'd say is like at Focused and me in general, I believe that management, in order to be an effective manager, you must control the compensation of your direct reports. It is the primary means in which you communicate performance to them. You cannot be a good manager, or you cannot be an effective manager saying you're crushing it, so happy, you're doing so well, you've grown so much, but I'm only able to give you a 1.5% raise this year. Because if that's the case, like all of a sudden what you've done is the manager is no longer representative of the firm. They're just a friend of the person, and they created a common enemy, which is the company. And so to me, what management is the person who is most responsible or solely responsible for creating predictable attrition inside of their team. And so what I mean by that is their job is to retain the best talent and understand why they are being retained, and to exit their poor performing talent proactively and understand why they are being exited. A poor performing manager is someone who has people leave their teams and their groups without being able to predict it, and or does not remove people from the team who are not like high performers. And so that is it. That is a manager's sole distilled job. But all this stuff falls out of that. So like people are like, well, wait, so my only job is to like fire and give raises to people? Like, no. Like your job is to retain the best talent because of the right reasons and exit the correct talent for the right reasons, and know when that's happening. And so how do you do that? Well, your best talent needs new challenges. They need new opportunities. They need growth. They need compensation. They need more leadership. They need maybe a new tech stack. Your most high potential talent needs coaching. It needs one-on-ones. They need mentorship. Your bottom performing talent needs direct feedback, needs active management, needs performance improvement plans. Like all of the stuff that managers do centers and boils down to, I want to keep or exit the right people at the right time. And so that's how we train our managers. But all of the tools that we learn about in the manager tools, books and podcasts and all that stuff, those are all for that. And we should be using all of those tools to do that. That's my take on management at the end of the day.
I suspect that there's not many management training classes that teach you about that.
I think they hide from it. They don't. And I think they hide from it. And we take it head on in our first kind of management training materials. We say that. And we say it's not heartless. I was sitting around a dinner yesterday talking about this, and people are like, when I finally have made the decision to like let someone go, the whole team is like, wow, why did it take you so long? And like managers often are the last to make that decision because they don't have the proactive conversations with each other about how to curate and cultivate like the appropriate talent. And no, I don't think they approach it directly. Firing is one part of it, but like firing is a very dramatic and last resort answer to a lot of other failed things. An interview failed, coaching failed, one-on-ones failed, performance improvement failed. But those things had to be tried. And eventually, like it's kind to allow someone to go someplace else or exit someone so they can go someplace they can be successful. Because normally they're not, because the culture is not right, not because they're bad.
Austin, a lot of deep and interesting thoughts there. If people want to continue the conversation, where can they find you?
I am pretty active on social, so you can find me Austin BV on LinkedIn, X, all over the place. But any social with that handle is me. So reach out, please. I'd love to talk to you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thanks for letting me ramble.